When I left the Army after 22 years of service, I thought I'd finally earned a quiet life. No more early deployments, no more sleeping in foxholes, no more bureaucracy that eats you alive from the inside out. All I wanted was a garden, a porch swing, and the sound of birds instead of helicopters. So when I found a modest brick home tucked in a cul-de-sac of Pine Hills, it felt like peace. Pine Hills was the kind of place where the lawns were always mowed, the mailboxes all matched, and the street names were inspired by trees that didn't even grow here: Sycamore Ridge, Willow Bend, and my personal favorite, Aspen Circle, in the middle of South Texas. There was a certain sterile beauty to it, predictable, controlled. After years of chaos, that control looked like safety. The house itself wasn't big, but it had good bones. A 2-car garage, 3 bedrooms, and a back deck that overlooked a small slope lined with scrub oaks. It had potential. I imagined planting native wildflowers, maybe even building a rain catchment system. I'd read up on drought gardening during my last tour. It was time to live close to the earth again. I was unpacking boxes in the garage when a sharp knock came at the door. A tall woman in a crimson blazer and oversized sunglasses stood there holding a clipboard and a thick binder. "Good morning, welcome to Pine Hills," she said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Myers, president of the HOA. I wiped my hands on my jeans and offered a handshake. She didn't take it. She handed me the binder. "This contains the community bylaws. Please be sure to read them thoroughly. We take our standards very seriously here." I flipped open the binder and saw a dizzying list of restrictions, everything from paint colors to approved grass seed. I smiled politely and nodded, but something about her tone bristled me. It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. That night, I sat out on the deck sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the oaks. I watched the sprinklers on the neighboring lawns pop up in perfect unison, wasting gallons of water on already green grass. It was late spring and the drought warnings had started again. But Pine Hills didn't seem to care. Water was just another aesthetic tool here. A few days later, I noticed a construction crew behind the community clubhouse. They were setting up some kind of equipment, large, loud, and humming. It looked like drilling. I figured it might be for landscaping or foundation repair. But as the days went by, more trucks arrived. No company logos, just plain white vans. I asked one of the workers what they were doing, and he muttered something about irrigation upgrades before walking off. I started to get curious. Back in the Army, I spent years in engineering and infrastructure logistics. I knew a drill rig when I saw one, and I knew what a water well looked like, especially the kind you didn't want people asking questions about. A week later, I stopped by the HOA office to ask Karen Myers about it. Her assistant made me wait for 40 minutes before she finally waved me in, visibly annoyed. "What can I help you with, Mr. Tom Reese, house on Aspen Circle?" She nodded without looking up from her monitor. "I was just wondering about the drilling near the clubhouse. Looks like they're putting in wells." She sighed. "They're installing a supplemental irrigation system for the green spaces. Totally standard. Approved by the board. Permitted." She looked up, then her expression tightening. "That's not your concern." I kept my voice level. I spent a lot of time studying water systems in the military. Drilling without permits can destabilize soil. Especially around here, we've got limestone underlayment, karst terrain, real sinkhole country. Her smile returned brittle and cold. "We have everything under control, Mr. Reese. If you have concerns, please submit them in writing." That was my first real taste of how things worked in Pine Hills. You didn't ask questions, you didn't poke the bear, and you definitely didn't challenge Karen Myers. Weeks went by. The drilling expanded. I noticed new patches of grass springing up around the clubhouse green, almost unnaturally so, even though the rest of the county had entered Stage 2 water restrictions. Meanwhile, I was collecting rainwater in barrels, reusing dishwater for my garden, trying to live in balance with the land. Then came the first letter. "Dear Mr. Reese, your mailbox is 3.2 inches taller than the community standard. Please correct this violation within 10 days to avoid fines." I stared at the paper in disbelief. My mailbox, I'd inherited it from the last owner. It hadn't been a problem for a decade. But now it was a violation. I adjusted the mailbox. Then came the second letter. My lawn was too natural, and the HOA demanded I replace the native grasses with St. Augustine, which drank water like a sponge in the desert. Then the third, my rain barrels were unsightly. I was given 7 days to remove them or face escalating fines. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about silencing me. I'd only lived here 3 months, and already I was being backed into a corner. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every photo of the trucks, every drone image of the drilling sites. I still had friends in state government. A couple from my military days had gone on to work in environmental compliance. Something didn't smell right, and it wasn't just the mud piling up near the wells. And so the quiet life I came here for started slipping away. But I'd been trained for pressure. I wasn't going to break. I was going to watch. I was going to wait. And when the ground finally gave way, when everything Karen Myers thought she controlled came crumbling down, I would be ready. It started with a subtle hum. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, not above the buzz of lawnmowers or the drone of passing SUVs. But I did. It came in the early mornings before dawn, when the rest of Pine Hills was still wrapped in its perfect little dreams. A low mechanical grumble carried by the soil itself, like a warning whispered through the bones of the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was just ambient noise from the freeway. But one morning, as I sipped black coffee on my back deck, I heard it again, louder this time. The ground trembled slightly underfoot enough to rattle the spoon in my mug. Curious, I followed the vibration with my boots across the lawn and toward the greenbelt behind the houses. That's when I saw them 2 unmarked white trucks parked near a fence by the eastern retention pond. Their hoods were dusty, their license plates obscured with caked mud. A third truck, newer and cleaner, sat with its tailgate down and cables snaking out from the back. I recognized the setup: instantly mobile drilling rig, and they were working on another site. This one wasn't even near the clubhouse. It was in a low-lying area that hadn't seen any activity since I moved in. No signage, no permits posted, just a bunch of workers in faded jeans and neon vests operating heavy machinery on HOA land. Not city land, not county managed. HOA controlled green space. I watched from behind a thicket of yaupon and cedar. One man manned the drill while another checked soil samples in plastic sleeves. This wasn't landscaping. This was exploratory boring. The drill hit something hard and paused. The vibration stopped. The crew huddled together, then began marking the ground with orange flags, flag after flag arcing around a patch of brittle soil. The kind of thing you do when you're mapping water flow or subterranean shifts. The kind of thing you definitely file permits for. But Karen Myers wasn't the type to wait for permission. She was the type to dare you to stop her. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the HOA office, pretending to drop off a payment envelope. Karen Myers wasn't there, but her assistant, a young man named Derek, sat behind the counter chewing gum and scrolling his phone. "Hey, Derek," I said casually. "What's going on near the pond? Didn't see a notice in the community bulletin." He blinked up at me, caught off guard. Just like drainage improvements, I think. Drainage needs that much drilling." He shrugged. "Karen Myers handles all that stuff. She said it's temporary." "Right?" I nodded. "Just curious. You know Army habit. I like to know what's going on under my feet." He gave me a tight smile. "Yeah, totally." But his eyes betrayed him. He knew something was off. He just didn't have the backbone or the job security to say it. That evening, I drove into town and pulled records from the municipal permitting office. I had friends there, Beth and Ron, both of whom had helped me transition after retirement. They let me log into the permit database and run a query on all recent drill permits issued within Pine Hills parcel. There were none. None. Not a single permit for boring, well installation, soil testing, or utility trenching had been filed in the past 6 months. Yet the HOA had already installed at least 3 wells, one behind the clubhouse, one near the tennis courts, and now one near the retention pond. My gut twisted. I printed the database query results and highlighted the relevant areas. Then I took a drive, slow, careful, and observant. I mapped each site I'd seen work at. I noted the fresh sod laid down around the clubhouse, the new irrigation nozzles hidden under decorative rocks, the faint smell of wet earth where there hadn't been any watering trucks. They weren't buying water from the city. They were drilling their own supply. Illegally. That explained the secrecy. That explained Karen Myers' evasiveness. She was circumventing municipal water regulations to keep the neighborhood pristine even as the rest of the county entered Stage 3 drought alerts. It also explained the aggressive tactics I was facing, the mailbox fines, the threats over my rain barrels. I was the only one asking questions, and she needed me quiet. The next day, I noticed a new compliance notice taped to my door. This time, it claimed I had exceeded the community's noise threshold by operating mechanical equipment after hours. I hadn't touched a power tool in over a week. It was fabricated, and I knew it. Still, I played along. I nodded politely when I saw Karen Myers at the Saturday HOA brunch. I even brought banana bread. I let her smile at me like a benevolent queen holding court. But under the table, I was already planning my next move. I set up a trail camera facing the greenbelt. Not one that was obvious, but a camouflaged model meant for wildlife tracking. I mounted it high in an oak tree and angled it toward the drilling zone. Motion activated, infrared, silent. Within 2 days, it captured footage of late-night activity, more white trucks, more unlicensed equipment, more movement of large pipes and cylindrical tanks. One truck bore a private water services company name that I recognized from a lawsuit back in Arizona, non-compliance with aquifer regulations. It was worse than I thought. Karen Myers wasn't just drilling for water. She was tapping into a deep layer aquifer with no oversight, no pressure control, and no environmental assessments. In an area full of karst formations that meant cavities, fissures, unpredictable flow patterns. Sinkhole territory. And she was doing it right under her neighbor's feet. I knew I couldn't take this straight to the city council, not yet. HOA boards had lawyers on retainer. Karen Myers would spin it as a miscommunication. By the time investigations caught up, the damage might already be done. I needed more. So I emailed Mark Jennings, former Army Corps of Engineers, now working for the State Geological Survey. We'd served together in Afghanistan, mapping unstable rock formations after landslides. I attached photos, permit records, and footage from the trail cam. His reply was short. "Tom, this is a disaster waiting to happen. Don't let them dig another inch. M." But I didn't have the authority to stop them. Not yet. So I did the next best thing. I started watching closer. Every morning, every afternoon, every night, because something beneath Pine Hills was moving. And if Karen Myers wouldn't stop digging, then the earth might just swallow her whole. The drilling intensified in the weeks that followed. It no longer occurred in just isolated pockets behind community centers or retention ponds. Now rigs started popping up behind private homes, mostly along the edge of the development, where older couples lived who didn't ask questions or had already signed away rights without fully reading the small print in their HOA notices. It was subtle, insidious. The crews operated mostly at dusk, then wrapped up before dawn. Residents would wake up to find strange chalk markings on their back patios or lines spray-painted along fences. Karen Myers had even drafted a conveniently vague memo explaining that the HOA was performing necessary irrigation optimization work as part of a Beautify Pine Hills campaign. The wording was carefully chosen. It sounded harmless, almost noble. But it meant nothing. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, not as a dissenter, but as an observer. I sat near the back of the room in one of the folding chairs beneath the humming fluorescence of the Pine Hills Community Hall. Karen Myers stood at the podium dressed in her usual crimson blazer, addressing a room full of sleepy neighbors with that sugary tone that masked her iron will. "We're entering an exciting new chapter in Pine Hills," she announced. "As you all know, our water needs have increased due to improvements to our landscaping, our newly expanded tennis court irrigation system, and the splash pad we're building for the summer." A few heads turned in mild surprise. Splash pad. To ensure we're not overly reliant on the city during drought season, she continued, the board has voted to implement a supplemental groundwater program using private wells, all fully within our rights as a self-managed community. She smiled wider. "And to those of you concerned, rest assured the geology of our neighborhood has been reviewed by our consultants. There is zero risk to any homes." That last part sent a jolt up my spine. Not because it was wrong, but because she knew exactly what she was denying. There hadn't been any public discussion. No geology review had been filed with the county. No environmental assessment reports were available in the HOA records, and yet here she was speaking like it had already been vetted and approved. I raised my hand. Karen Myers' eyes flicked to me, and narrowed ever so slightly. "Yes, Mr. Reese, is it?" I stood slowly. "Has a hydrology report been completed for these wells? We're in a karst zone. Aggressive groundwater extraction can trigger cavity collapse. That's how sinkholes form, especially in areas like this." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Karen Meyer's smile stiffened. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Reese. But this isn't a geology class. The board has retained professionals. Have you made the reports available to residents? Our consultants are private contractors. Their findings are proprietary." I let that sink in. "So you're saying residents just have to trust you?" I asked, folding my arms. "Even when you're drilling without city permits on land adjacent to occupied homes?" Karen Meyer's expression hardened, but she kept her voice sweet. "Mr. Reese, if you're feeling unsafe, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you." The crowd went silent. It was a line meant to humiliate me, to isolate me. It was code, really. "Sit down or get out." I sat down, but not out of defeat. I needed to see how the room would react. And to my disappointment, they didn't. A few people glanced at each other awkwardly, but most just shifted in their seats or stared at their phones. One man near the front even nodded in approval. Karen Myers finished the meeting with a polished flourish, thanking everyone for their trust and civic cooperation. No one challenged her. No one asked more questions. And the next day, drilling resumed. By then, I'd tracked at least 5 distinct well sites: lodged behind the clubhouse, near the tennis courts adjacent to the retention pond, behind Lot 49, which bordered a steep embankment, and most concerning near Aspen Circle, less than 60 yards from my own home. The HOA was building a web of water access points, all unauthorized, tapping into a vulnerable underground system like veins being sliced open without caution. Late one night, I walked the greenbelt under moonlight following the fresh tire tracks left by the rigs. I crouched near one of the capped wellheads and pressed my hand to the soil. It was damp. The kind of damp that doesn't happen in drought season, not unless water was being drawn upward, pooling around the shaft, eroding silently below. And then I heard it, the faintest crack beneath my boot. Not wood, not brush. Rock. Fracturing. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. The crust beneath us wasn't stable. It was shifting, expanding, like a stretched rubber band about to snap. I uploaded all my findings to a secure cloud server, photos, GPS coordinates, permit records, or lack thereof. I even began drafting a full incident report citing geological studies on the karst topography of our region. I planned to send it to the State Department of Natural Resources. But I also knew from experience these agencies moved slowly. Meanwhile, Karen Myers moved fast. A week later, I got another violation notice. This one said, "My American flag." The one I'd hung respectfully on my porch was unauthorized signage. That was the final straw. She wasn't just ignoring the law. She was retaliating, now systematically targeting me in petty ways designed to break my will. But she underestimated me. I'd spent my life building bridges in war zones, navigating bureaucracies in foreign languages, and diffusing IEDs in the desert. I could handle a power-hungry HOA president in a suburban neighborhood. And I was going to bury her not with rage but with proof. Because something deep underground was growing unstable. And if she kept drilling, that quiet, perfect street of hers would be the first to fall. I didn't sleep much that week. Every night I lay in bed with the trail cam footage playing on loop in my mind. Grainy images of drilling rigs, slow-moving tankers, and workers feeding long pipes into the ground under moonlight. The more I saw, the worse the knot in my gut grew. I submitted a formal letter to the HOA board. 3 pages, double-spaced, referencing 6 geological surveys and 2 state statutes. I wasn't aggressive. I kept my tone respectful, factual. I pointed out that unregulated drilling in karst terrain was not only dangerous but potentially criminal under state environmental laws. I offered to meet with the board in private to explain further. I even included my resume highlighting my work as a former Army engineer with expertise in subgrade stability. I mailed it, I hand-delivered it, I emailed it. No one responded. Instead, the very next morning I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice staked into my front lawn. This one claimed that my front-facing security camera violated the community's aesthetic standards. It wasn't even visible from the street. Later that day, I got a fine for having non-conforming vegetation in my flower beds meaning the drought-tolerant native plants I had spent weeks cultivating were now suddenly against code. My mailbox, yes, the one I had already resized per their last complaint, was again flagged for non-uniform paint shade. It was all nonsense. This wasn't compliance enforcement. This was retaliation. I attended the next board meeting again this time, recording everything with a pen cam tucked into my jacket. I brought printed copies of my report and tried to hand them out, but Karen Myers cut me off before I could speak. "Mr. Reese," she said, smiling thinly, "this is not a forum for conspiracy theories. I'm presenting documented geological risk," I said, holding up the paperwork. "You're drilling illegally into an aquifer that supports the structural integrity of this entire neighborhood." Karen Myers' voice was calm, but loud enough for the room to hear. "You're making residents uncomfortable with your accusations. This is your final warning to cease disruptive behavior. If you persist, we will initiate formal proceedings to remove you from the HOA." "Remove me," I said, laughing in disbelief. "You don't have the authority to remove a homeowner." She leaned closer. "You'd be surprised what our covenants allow, Mr. Reese." I stood still, breathing slow, watching the faces around me. Some neighbors looked worried. A few avoided eye contact. Most just looked confused or irritated, like I was a kid yelling fire in a movie theater, ruining their night. And in a way, that's exactly how Karen Myers had painted me. The alarmist veteran, with too much time on his hands. The man who just couldn't let go of control after retirement. The problem. It was brilliant, really. But I knew I was right. After the meeting, I stepped out into the parking lot, fuming. That's when I saw one of the newer residents, Mrs. Lopez, standing by her SUV with her toddler in the back seat. She gave me a cautious smile. "I read your report," she said in a quiet voice. I blinked. "You did?" She nodded. "It was left in my mailbox. I thought it was a flyer. But I read the whole thing." I paused, unsure what to say. "My cousin lives in Florida," she added. "Her subdivision had a sinkhole open up under the playground. They never rebuilt." She hesitated, then looked over her shoulder, lowering her voice further. "Karen Myers told everyone you were trying to bankrupt the HOA. Said you were litigious." "Litigious," I scoffed. "I haven't even hired a lawyer." "She said you used your military connections to get government people to spy on us." I exhaled slowly. "That's what she's telling people." She nodded. "I just wanted to say, I don't believe her." That was the first moment I realized Karen Myers wasn't invincible. She was powerful, yes. Manipulative, yes. But she wasn't untouchable. Her control only worked as long as the neighborhood stayed afraid or apathetic. All it would take was enough people waking up. So I doubled down. I printed color flyers with QR codes linking to my cloud folder trail cam videos, permit records, hydrogeological maps. I slid them under doormats, inside mailboxes, behind windshield wipers. I posted anonymously in the Pine Hills Facebook group using a burner account. I distributed data to anyone who'd take it. Some neighbors ignored me. Others called me paranoid. But a few started asking questions, quietly, cautiously, but they were asking. And still, Karen Myers kept drilling. I filed a formal complaint with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I knew it would take weeks, maybe months. But I also knew the wheels of bureaucracy moved fastest when supported by media attention. So I made a burner Gmail. I sent everything to 4 local news outlets: photos, documents, maps. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. I just needed someone to look. Then something happened that I couldn't ignore. One morning, walking out to grab my paper, I noticed a long fracture snaking its way along the edge of the curb on Sycamore Ridge Drive. It wasn't a normal crack. It had depth, maybe half an inch wide, and 6 feet long, angling downward toward the newest well site. I followed it, and it led straight to a slight depression in the ground that hadn't been there the week before. I dropped to one knee and examined the soil. It was pulling away from the edges like the beginning of a subsidence event. It had started. The ground was shifting. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening, really listening to the earth beneath the neighborhood. And around 2:37 a.m., I felt it. A soft, low rumble that passed under the floor like a sigh from the deep. Just long enough to raise the hair on my arms. Just long enough to tell me that time was running out. Karen Myers could ignore my warnings. The board could dismiss my expertise. But the earth wouldn't ignore them. And when it came, it wouldn't send a letter first. It would swallow them whole. The very next morning, I stepped outside to find my truck windshield cracked clean through diagonal from the base of the driver's side to the top right corner. At first, I thought it was the cool night air colliding with the leftover summer heat. But then I saw the small object lying beneath the wiper blade. A rock, small, jagged, with a streak of white paint still clinging to its edge. I picked it up, turned it over, and exhaled. On the underside, scrawled in thick black Sharpie, were 3 words: "Leave or pay." I stood there for a long moment, the morning sun creeping up over the rooftops, painting the HOA manicured lawns in golden light, as if nothing was wrong. As if everything was still peaceful. But my hands were trembling, fists clenched around the rock. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was personal. I knew it couldn't have been random vandalism. Pine Hills didn't get random. The streets had security cameras on nearly every corner. Neighbors reported cars parked too long on the street, like it was a national emergency. No, this wasn't a teenager playing a prank. This was someone sending a message. Karen Myers, or someone acting on her behalf. I filed a police report, not because I expected them to do anything, but because I wanted a paper trail. I knew how to build a case, document everything. Time, date, photos, witnesses, even if they were scarce. The officer who came to take my statement was polite but distant. He jotted down a few notes, then leaned on his cruiser door like he had somewhere better to be. "You sure it wasn't a kid?" he asked. "No note from a kid I've ever seen ends with a cracked windshield," I said, holding up the rock. "And there aren't many kids in Pine Hills." He shrugged. "We'll keep an eye on the neighborhood." I watched him drive off and disappear around the corner. I wasn't sure anyone would be keeping an eye on anything. That afternoon, I received an official certified letter from the HOA, delivered via courier, no less. Inside was a notice of violation hearing, scheduled for the following Monday. The alleged infractions were stacked like firewood. Defamatory statements about the HOA and its board members. Unauthorized distribution of misleading material. Non-compliant exterior modifications, camera installation. Violation of Community Harmony Clause. Community Harmony Clause. That one made me laugh out loud. It sounded like something lifted from a dystopian novel. The letter ended with a chilling line. "Failure to appear will constitute a waiver of your right to respond and may result in legal action, fines, or potential lien placement." They were building a case to break me, but what they didn't realize was that I'd already built mine. That night, I received a call from Mark Jennings, the geologist I'd served with. His voice was tight, urgent. "Tom," he said, "I ran the overlay on your neighborhood's strata maps with the well locations you sent. The whole development is built over a shallow network of limestone fissures. The more water they extract, the more instability they cause. You're not just looking at a sinkhole risk, you're looking at progressive failure. Which means it won't just be one sinkhole, it'll be multiple collapses. The soil's like wet tissue paper. If they've tapped into the aquifer, the water is acting like a temporary support. Pull enough of it out, and the whole layer caves in." "How soon?" He was quiet for a moment. "You said you saw cracking ground depression." "Yeah, on Sycamore Ridge." "Then it's already happening." I stared at the phone for a long moment after he hung up. It felt like I was the only one standing on a railroad track watching a freight train barreling forward while everyone else admired the flowers growing by the rails. I had one more card to play. The following day, I stood outside the Pine Hills Elementary School with a stack of envelopes. Inside each was a copy of the geological summary Mark Jennings had sent, photos of the well sites, and a warning letter addressed to each homeowner. I passed them out to parents as they picked up their kids. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I just said, "Please read this before next week." Some people thanked me. Some ignored me. A few threw the envelopes into their car seats without even opening them. But that afternoon, I got a knock on the door. Karen Myers, standing on my porch in her red blazer, sunglasses perched atop her head, flanked by 2 board members. I recognized Dale from landscaping and Miriam from events. Karen Myers didn't wait to be invited in. "You are distributing disinformation," she said plainly. "No," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I'm distributing facts you refuse to disclose." She stepped closer. "You're destabilizing the neighborhood, scaring residents, undermining the HOA's authority." I stared at her. "No, Karen Myers. You're the one destabilizing things. Literally. Underground. You're making a fool of yourself." Funny. That's not what the state geologist thinks. That made her blink. The first crack in the armor. Who, she asked. I smiled. Oh, just someone with more credentials than your consultants. Dale crossed his arms. Look, man, we can work this out. Maybe you just stop pushing this and I cut him off. This isn't about compromise. This is about safety. And you're all complicit. Karen Myers' smile dropped. This is your last chance to fall in line, Mr. Reese. No, Karen Myers, I said, stepping forward. This is your last chance, because if this street caves in and someone's kid gets hurt, no HOA clause in the world will save you from what's coming. She stormed off without another word. The board members followed. 2 days later, the local news van rolled into Pine Hills. They parked near the clubhouse camera crew, stepping out with long mics and a journalist in a crisp blue dress. I watched from my driveway as they tried to interview residents, some eager to speak, others hesitant. Eventually, the news crew walked up to my home. You, the retired engineer, the reporter asked. The one who filed the geological report. I am, I said, handing her a thumb drive. And everything you need is on here. By sunset, a drone buzzed overhead capturing aerial footage of the drilling rigs, the artificial green lawns, the cracked sidewalks. I knew the story wouldn't air that night. It would take a few days at least. But Karen Myers had seen them. And for the first time, since I moved into Pine Hills, she looked nervous. The air in Pine Hills shifted after the news crew came through. For the first time in months, Karen Myers didn't strut around the neighborhood like she owned every inch of it. Her blazer changed from crimson to navy then to beige, as if toning down her appearance could muffle the rising pressure closing in around her. But I knew better. Fear doesn't always come with screaming. Sometimes it walks silently, eyes darting behind curtains and blinds. By midweek, neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with me started nodding politely. A few even stopped by my porch while walking their dogs, asking quiet questions. Is it true? They'd murmur. Did she really drill without a permit? Is the ground unsafe? I answered them all, honestly. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The ground was speaking for itself now, cracks widening, soil pulling away from fence posts, pavement gently sinking near gutters. It was subtle, but to anyone paying attention, undeniable. So I kept moving. Karen Myers had threatened me with legal action. That was her weapon of choice, now claims of defamation disruption disorder. I knew what she was trying to do. She wanted me exhausted, wanted me chasing taillights in a storm. But I'd spent 2 decades learning to fight clean and quiet. And I wasn't tired, I was just getting started. I set up a second trail cam, this one on the far side of the neighborhood near the new splash pad Karen Myers was so proud of. It was freshly paved, surrounded by imported turf, and located only a few feet from one of the largest unauthorized wells. At night, the runoff from the pad bled straight into the soft limestone beneath it. The cam caught footage of late-night maintenance crews rerouting hoses underground, diverting city water into the wellheads. A closed-loop system of theft. I uploaded everything to my cloud folder and backed it up onto 3 separate hard drives. I kept one in a fireproof box, another mailed to my cousin in Amarillo, and the third hidden under the floorboards of my garage. I also contacted an old friend, Captain Amelia Ford, now a JAG officer stationed out of Fort Sam, Houston. She was fierce, brilliant, and not easily intimidated. I hadn't seen her in 10 years, but when I called and explained the situation, she asked me to email everything I had. By the end of that week, Captain Amelia Ford connected me with a former Department of Environmental Protection investigator who now worked independently. His name was Walter Klein, and he didn't mince words. I've seen HOA abuse before, he said during our first call, but this is corporate-level fraud disguised as neighborhood management. And if what you're saying is true about the aquifer access and misappropriated city utilities, it's more than environmental risk. It's criminal. I felt a strange sense of validation when he said it. Not vindictive, just real. For months, Karen Myers had tried to paint me as irrational, unstable, obsessive. But now I had voices louder than hers backing me. Voices with credentials and reach. I wasn't just a lone man shouting at the sky anymore. I was part of something larger. Something legal. Something dangerous to her. I shared with Walter Klein my footage, the emails I'd intercepted from residents who'd anonymously forwarded me, internal HOA messages, and the photographs of the trucks, many of which had license plates traced to a water extraction company out of state, operating without local registration. He asked me to track water usage for the entire neighborhood. I pulled up utility records, compared billing trends for homes with new landscaping against those without. The data was wild. Certain homes were using 3-4x the water, but paying the same municipal rates. That meant either illegal hookups, siphoning, or water theft. Possibly all three. Then I caught the break I didn't expect. One morning, a young man knocked at my door. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if someone had followed him. I recognized him after a second. It was Karen Myers' assistant from the HOA office. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, "but I saw what they did to your truck." I invited him in, offered him coffee. He sat stiffly on the edge of the dining chair, hands clutched around the mug, like it was the only solid thing in his world. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said. "At first, I thought you were just being paranoid." I said nothing. Let the silence do the work. But Karen Myers' been hiding the reports. There's no consultant, no hydrologist. She faked the signatures on the documents submitted to the board. I saw her do it. I leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" He nodded and pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. "This has emails, internal memos, scans of the original permits with blank fields. She never filed them. She's using HOA funds to pay the drillers directly, off books." I stared at the drive like it was a grenade with the pin pulled halfway out. "You're risking a lot by bringing this to me." Derek nodded slowly. "I know. But my dad's a contractor. He fell into a sinkhole once. Never walked the same again. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to one of the kids on this street." He left 20 minutes later, face-pale hands still shaking. I told him I'd keep his name out of it. He didn't answer. I called Walter Klein that night. When I told him about the USB, I could hear him breathe sharply on the other end. "You're sitting on a bomb, Tom," he said, "and we're going to drop it." 3 days later, I submitted a formal complaint to the Texas Attorney General's office and the state's Environmental Enforcement Division. Attached were 67 pages of documentation, 3 hours of footage, and a sworn statement from me detailing everything I had witnessed. I included the metadata logs from the USB Derek gave me, emails implicating Karen Myers in forgery, misuse of funds, and knowingly endangering public safety. Then I waited. But not idly. I planted signs around the community, simple, tasteful, with a link to a site I built. www.pinehillstruth.com http www.pinehillstruth.com. It wasn't flashy. It didn't accuse anyone by name. It just shared the facts, the well maps, the sinkhole risk models, the footage, the law. The page views climbed into the thousands within 48 hours. That's when Karen Myers sent me a cease and desist letter typed, notarized, and full of empty threats. It claimed I was violating HOA policies by disseminating unapproved communication materials and interfering with community cohesion. But she didn't send it via the HOA. She sent it from her personal attorney. And that told me everything, because now she was scared. And she had every reason to be. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that began too quiet. The air felt heavier the way it does before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. Just a stillness that made the birds quiet, and the trees seemed to lean in closer than they should. It had been 3 days since I filed the formal complaint. The website was still live. The signs were still up. Karen Myers hadn't shown her face in nearly a week. And then the first tremor hit. It was subtle at first, barely more than a shiver underfoot. I was in the backyard tending to the last of my native grasses when I felt the faintest movement beneath me, like a distant footstep that didn't belong to anyone. The wind stopped. I stood still listening. And then came the second tremor, this one deeper, more deliberate. A soft grinding sound followed, like concrete cracking under pressure, far off but unmistakable. My gut tightened. I dropped the spade and walked out to the front of the house. Aspen Circle curved gently downhill toward Sycamore Ridge. That was where I'd seen the first crack weeks ago. Now I saw 3 more jagged lines spiderwebbing outward from the curb, like veins in dry earth. And then the sound I'd feared most, a sharp snap, followed by a low groaning rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself. I ran down the street past the unblinking security cameras and picture-perfect flower beds until I reached Lot 73 Karen Myers' house. The street in front of it was sagging. Not just cracked, not just shifting. sinking. The asphalt had started to buckle, and part of the curb had collapsed into a growing depression, roughly 15 feet wide and spreading fast. Karen Meyer's luxury SUV, which had been parked half on the sidewalk, had tilted downward, one front tire dangling in the air, the other submerged in what looked like mud where asphalt used to be. I stood across the street watching the earth ripple like water around the edge of the hole. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the low whine of stressed metal. Then the street gave way. There was no dramatic explosion, no earth-shattering boom, just a horrifying wet collapse. The sinkhole opened in slow motion, swallowing Karen Meyer's driveway, her mailbox, part of the sidewalk, and most of the SUV, which slid into the earth with a metallic screech before vanishing completely into the void. Someone screamed. I turned and saw a teenager standing on his porch across the street, holding a phone recording. Within minutes, more neighbors came out. Phones raised, voices rising. No one ran. No one dared move too close. We all just watched, frozen as the beautiful symmetry of Pine Hills came undone in front of our eyes. Karen Myers came outside barefoot, still in her silk robe. Her hair was disheveled and her face was pale, drained of the smug confidence that had once defined every HOA meeting. She stared at the sinkhole, at her half-swallowed yard, at the twisted metal tailpipe of her SUV poking out like a severed limb. Then she screamed. It wasn't just panic. It was denial, desperation, disbelief, all rolled into one. Her voice cracked as she yelled for help, for someone to do something. But there was nothing to do. The earth had spoken. It had caught up with her. Emergency vehicles arrived within 15 minutes, fire trucks, police cruisers, a geological response unit from the county. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, shouting for residents to step back. Drones buzzed overhead, recording the damage. An officer knocked on my door to ask if I had noticed any early signs. I told him about the tremors, about the cracks, about the letters. Then I handed him the full printed report. It was bound now, neatly labeled. It included the trail cam footage, the maps, the emails from Derek, and the signatures Karen Myers had forged. He took it, flipping through the pages slowly. "You're the one who submitted the complaint to the Attorney General's office?" he asked. "I am." He nodded. "We're going to need to talk more." They marked Karen Myers' house as unfit for occupancy. Before sunset, the damage to the street had compromised the entire utility grid in the area. Power was shut off to 6 homes. Water lines were exposed. Gas lines had to be inspected. Karen Myers stood by her front door, wrapped in a blanket, now crying. No one went to her, not even the board members. That night, I received an email from the local NBC affiliate. The reporter I had spoken to weeks before had put together a piece. The silent collapse, one man's warning, one neighborhood's wake-up call. It was already trending. My website received over 10,000 hits in a single evening. But more importantly, I received a phone call. It was from Walter Klein. "You did it," he said. I didn't reply at first. My eyes were fixed on the sinkhole, barely visible now in the dim moonlight, covered by emergency tarps and surrounded by cones. "No," I said finally. "The ground did it. I just listened." The next day, state investigators arrived. And this time, they weren't taking polite notes, they were issuing subpoenas. Derek was called in to testify. The HOA's financial records were seized. The drillers who had worked at night vanished like ghosts. But the evidence held. And when they checked the water meters and aquifer draw data, it matched everything I'd written. Karen Myers was arrested 2 weeks later. Officially, the charges were environmental negligence, falsification of legal documents, unauthorized groundwater extraction, and misappropriation of HOA funds. She was booked in the county jail, released on bond, but barred from setting foot in Pine Hills again, pending the trial. And just like that, the queen of HOA was gone. But the ground was still trembling. Crews worked for months to stabilize the area. Engineers brought in heavy grouting equipment, pumping limestone slurry into the fractured voids beneath the street. Some homes were condemned. Others had their foundations shored up with steel supports. Lawsuits flew in every direction against the HOA, the drillers, even the city, for failure to enforce permitting. But my house stood. It had always stood. Because I'd been paying attention from day one. Because I hadn't been afraid to speak. And now, for the first time since I'd moved into Pine Hills, people were listening. By Monday, Pine Hills didn't feel like Pine Hills anymore. News vans lined the main road, their satellite dishes spinning in the early morning sun. Reporters with flawless hair and creased suits paced in front of cameras, gesturing toward what was once the cleanest cul-de-sac in the neighborhood, now a scar of twisted asphalt and hollowed-out ground. The sinkhole had grown overnight. Despite emergency crews working nonstop to secure the area, the depression had widened by nearly 6 feet and swallowed more of Karen Myers' driveway, half of the neighbor's side lawn, and ominously, one of the electrical utility poles near the curb. The pole had tilted forward like a tree trying to fall, but not quite ready, its wires hanging slack in the air like strands of a snapped web. The worst part wasn't what we could see. It was what we couldn't. The engineers brought in by the county explained it in careful, practiced terms. Subterranean voids, karst erosion, aquifer drainage, instability. But what they really meant was, we don't know how deep it goes. We don't know what else it might take. Standing behind the yellow caution tape, I watched them lower a thermal scanner into the ground, an articulated arm attached to a robotic rig with heat and density sensors. When the preliminary readings came back, I heard one of the younger techs whisper, "Damn, it's hollow all the way to the water table." Karen Myers' house sat right on the edge of that hollow. The once pristine home with its granite-tiled front steps and wrought iron address numbers now looked haunted. The porch had cracked in two. Her once perfect flower beds had slumped inward, sagging like a sinking ship. The windows were dark. She hadn't returned. After her arrest, she'd posted bail, retained a very expensive attorney, and disappeared to a condo downtown, far from the crumbling streets of her former kingdom. But her name remained on every financial ledger, and most damning of all, the HOA's own meeting transcripts, where she had waved off concerns about neighborhood geology as pseudoscience. Derek, her former assistant, had cooperated fully. Under oath, he confirmed everything. The forged consultant reports the cash payments to the drillers and the instructions Karen Myers had given him to shred internal memos once questions started being asked. He gave them the location of her personal storage unit, too. Inside, they found boxes labeled with HOA funds and handwritten notes detailing Phase 2 expansion, which included plans for 2 more wells behind residents' properties. Her emails were worse. One of them read, "If anyone asks questions, bury them in fines. Noise violations, grass height, whatever sticks." She had tried to crush me beneath paperwork. Instead, she got swallowed by the earth. The rest of the board panicked. One by one, they resigned. Miriam Dale, even Walter the treasurer, who claimed he'd had no idea what Karen Myers was really doing. But their names were on too many approvals. The state wasn't interested in apologies. They were building a criminal negligence case that reached further than Karen Myers' backyard. As all this unfolded, I kept to my daily routine. I watered what was left of my garden. I waved at neighbors I once thought would never acknowledge me. Some of them quietly, hesitantly began asking how they could help, how to protect their homes, how to make things right. I told them what I'd learned. Start by listening to the ground beneath you. Then on Thursday, just past 11 p.m., the sinkhole expanded again. This time it happened fast. The streetlights flickered once, twice, then died. I was in my living room when I heard it. A low roar, followed by the sharp percussive cracking of pavement tearing apart. It sounded like 1,000 tree trunks being snapped in half at once. I stepped onto the porch in time to see half the street vanish into itself. Karen Myers' house went with it. The entire front facade collapsed in slow motion, porch first, then the upper balcony, then the second story, as the support beams gave way. The roof caved in last, folding inward like a broken wing. A plume of dust rose up into the night sky, lit by the flashing red and blue of the emergency lights as first responders surged down the block again. No one was hurt. The house had been empty. But the crowd that gathered to watch, they didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They stood in silence, some with their hands to their mouths, others holding on to loved ones. This wasn't victory. It was a reckoning. A slow-motion disaster they had almost all ignored until it was too late. And yet, for the first time, I felt the weight begin to lift. Not because Karen Myers had been punished. That wasn't my goal. But because the truth had come out. Because justice, however it had arrived visibly. In the weeks that followed, Pine Hills transformed. The county stepped in to oversee the HOA during the investigation. A temporary board of residents was elected real neighbors this time. People who planted their own gardens, who had dirty knees from crawling under sinks instead of sitting behind desks, issuing threats. They asked me to serve on the interim board. I declined. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd spent too long fighting. I needed rest, peace. I offered to advise them to share my records to help install safety procedures that prioritized integrity over image. Instead of HOA fines, they created volunteer cleanup days. Instead of mail slot threats, they created monthly town halls. Instead of power, they chose presence. And slowly the fear faded. The sinkhole was eventually filled with stabilized concrete and support beams, but it was never paved over. The new board decided to leave it exposed. A permanent reminder. They surrounded it with a wrought iron fence and a plaque that read, "In memory of what we ignored. In honor of those who refused to be silent." It was simple, powerful, and deeply personal. One morning, as I walked past the site, I saw a child, maybe 6 or 7, pressing their face against the fence, staring into the earth. His mother knelt beside him, pointing at the plaque, explaining softly. I didn't hear the words. I didn't need to. Because stories like ours have a way of echoing. Not just in the news, or the courtrooms, or the basements, filled with paperwork, but in the quiet, where people finally start to listen. The official state investigation began the Monday after the second collapse. By then, Karen Myers had disappeared completely from public life. Her lawyer claimed she was receiving medical care for stress-induced health complications. But the truth was, she was hiding. Her house, what was left of it, had become a symbol, a cautionary tale shown nightly on the local news. The state wasn't subtle when they arrived. Unmarked government SUVs rolled through Pine Hills just after sunrise. Agents in khakis and polos stepped out with clipboards and shoulder bags marked with the seal of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality (TCEQ) and the Office of the Attorney General. These weren't neighborhood code enforcers. These were environmental prosecutors, geological engineers, and fraud investigators. They moved in pairs, taking measurements, photographing drill sites, inspecting storm drains, interviewing homeowners. And they didn't knock gently. I watched as they descended on the old HOA office, the same place Karen Myers used to hold her smug little meetings. The room where she once told me, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you. Now that room was being turned upside down. They carried out boxes of binders, scanned every document, pulled USB drives from locked drawers. The office door was sealed with yellow tape marked "Pending Investigation." One investigator told me off the record that most of the files inside had been doctored or were missing altogether. But you were smart, he said, flipping through my personal report. You documented everything. The county followed up with an emergency session to address Pine Hill's legal status. Because the HOA's board had entirely resigned or been implicated, control temporarily shifted to a state-appointed receiver, a stern woman named Deborah Hines. She was part lawyer, part auditor, and completely unbothered by HOA drama. Deborah Hines wasn't there to play politics. She was there to buy clean house. She met with residents in the elementary school cafeteria, no longer trusting the integrity of any structure associated with the former HOA. I've seen cases like this, she said plainly. Not many, but enough. HOA funds misused public safety, violated oversight, completely abandoned. The good news is, you're not powerless anymore. The crowd applauded. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. For the first time, people were showing up, not to complain about fence colors or hedge heights, but to learn, to listen, to ask what they could do to rebuild. Deborah Hines laid it out for them. Would freeze all HOA accounts during the audit. Karen Myers' assets were being reviewed for restitution claims. Residents who had paid fines under false pretenses would receive refunds. All unauthorized wells would be permanently sealed and capped. A third-party engineering firm would conduct a full geological survey of the remaining land. We're going to put the earth back under your feet, she said. The applause was louder this time. As this unfolded, I kept my distance. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally could. For months, I had carried the weight of knowing what no one else wanted to see. Now that burden had been transferred first to the state, then to the people themselves. My job wasn't over, but it had changed. I was no longer shouting into the void. They were listening now. That week, a neighbor named Janine stopped by my house. She was in her 60s, soft-spoken, the kind of person who had kept to herself for most of the year. She handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of her HOA correspondence over the last 12 months, fines for things like minor mailbox rust and unapproved solar lighting. All totaled nearly 2,300 in penalties, some of which she'd paid through tears because Karen Myers had threatened to place liens on her property. "I'm not the only one," Janine said. "But I didn't know who to trust until I saw what you did." I added her documents to the growing file I was organizing with Walter Klein, the independent investigator. He was building a civil case, one that would go beyond criminal negligence and push for financial restitution to the neighborhood. With every new piece of evidence, the case grew stronger. Karen Myers' lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that neighborhood issues should be resolved internally. The judge laughed. Literally. I sat in the back of the courtroom when it happened. The motion hearing was open to the public, and I wanted to see it for myself. The judge leaned back, looked over his glasses, and said, "You're arguing internal resolution. After your client illegally drilled into a fragile aquifer, falsified documents, and triggered a collapse that swallowed an entire street." He denied the motion in under a minute. Karen Myers was ordered to appear for a full deposition within 30 days. She delayed once, twice, but eventually the court gave her no choice. When the transcript came out, the contents spread like wildfire. Under oath, she admitted to hiring unlicensed contractors for drilling, falsifying HOA consultant reports, personally approving over $80,000 in unauthorized expenditures, directing board members to target dissenting homeowners with violations. She tried to justify it, said she was protecting property values, said she felt pressured to maintain appearances, said the water supply was her responsibility. But no one bought it. The final nail came from the drillers themselves, two of whom had flipped for immunity in exchange for testimony. They admitted Karen Myers instructed them to ignore permitting and get the job done before anyone could report it. The state concluded their investigation 6 months later with a scathing 87-page report. The summary read, "The HOA president knowingly endangered residents by authorizing unauthorized groundwater drilling on geologically unstable land, resulting in property destruction, public safety risk, and widespread erosion of civic trust." Karen Myers faced 4 felony charges and multiple civil suits. The state recommended dissolving the existing HOA entity and starting fresh under a new legal structure, one with mandatory oversight and transparency. And Pine Hills, it started healing. Slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. The sinkhole was filled. Grass began to grow along its rim. Children played again, though their parents kept a closer watch. Neighbors spoke to each other, really spoke, not just waved from driveways. They organized potlucks, voted on bylaws, and most importantly, showed up to meetings they used to avoid. The new board included a retired teacher, a mechanic, a nurse. People who lived humbly, worked hard, and understood that power in a neighborhood wasn't about control, it was about care. They offered me a position again. This time I said yes. Not because I wanted it, but because it felt like the right time to help rebuild not just the land, but the spirit of where we lived. And as I sat at that first meeting, no Karen Myers, no threats, no lawsuits. Just a folding table, a pitcher of lemonade, and neighbors listening with open minds. I knew something had shifted for good. Not just in Pine Hills, but in me. The summer after the collapse was the first in a long time that felt like summer was supposed to feel. It was hot, sure, it was Texas, but the heat felt earned. Honest. Kids rode their bikes again without parents pulling them back from the sidewalks. People barbecued on weekends, waving to each other across driveways that for months had been lined with tension and silence. And Pine Hills began to grow roots again, real ones this time. The new HOA board, 5 people, none of whom had ever served before, met every second Saturday under a rented canopy in the park. No podiums, no microphones, just folding chairs, printed agendas, and a whiteboard someone had rescued from the elementary school. There were no fines handed out, no veiled threats, no hidden votes. Instead, there were conversations. One day, Miriam, the former board member who had stood next to Karen Myers the day she threatened me, came to a meeting. She stood at the edge of the group for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. I didn't know what she was doing. Not really. But I also didn't ask. I didn't want to know. She paused. I'm sorry. Nobody applauded. Nobody scolded her either. The silence that followed wasn't cold, it was full. Sometimes forgiveness is louder when it comes without fireworks. Miriam became the new community garden coordinator. We turned the old drilling sites after they'd been sealed, stabilized, and checked by the geologists into native plant gardens. It started as symbolic. Then it turned into something more. Blazing star butterfly, weed blue salvia, they took to the land quickly, like the soil had been waiting for something worth blooming. Children helped plant milkweed for monarch butterflies. A group of veterans from down the road helped build benches from reclaimed wood, each with brass plates etched with words chosen by the community. Trust the truth. Speak even when your voice shakes. The earth remembers. I remember the day we held a memorial service at the edge of the former sinkhole. It wasn't formal. No prayers, no speeches. Just a gathering of neighbors under the shade of a post oak tree. Deborah Hines, the state-appointed receiver, attended quietly and handed over official control back to the residents. This neighborhood has learned something, she told me privately. Something most never do. She didn't need to elaborate. I knew. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I sat on my porch and watched a line of solar lanterns blink to life along the new walking path that skirted the repaired section of road. It was the same road that had once caved in, had swallowed Karen Myers' kingdom whole. Now it stood strong again. Supported. Reinforced. There were still reminders, of course. The scar in the pavement, slightly discolored from the concrete fill. The metal fence surrounding the green space, once occupied by Karen Myers' house, left empty by court order. And that plaque centered along the path set into the stone. We failed to listen. The earth reminded us. We learned. I had written it, but I never told anyone. It wasn't about taking credit. It was about leaving something behind that mattered. Because if there's one thing the Army taught me, it's that the battles worth fighting aren't always against enemies. Sometimes they're against silence, apathy, the slow erosion of integrity. And this time we had won. Not just because Karen Myers was gone. Not because the lawsuits were settling or the fines were being refunded. We won because people started looking at each other differently, with empathy, with awareness, with accountability. Even Derek, the assistant, who once handed out violation notices like they were pizza flyers, found his place again. He now helped run the community website, sharing updates about garden events, safety tips, and reminders for street cleanup days. No more threats, just information. He stopped by my place one afternoon, handed me a small box. Inside was the rock, the one they had thrown at my windshield. I found it behind the HOA office, he said, sheepish. After the investigators cleared it out, thought you might want it back. I turned the rock over in my hands. The faded words were still there. Leave or pay. I smiled. I guess I did both. We laughed. For once it wasn't bitter. That fall I planted a new tree. In the corner of my yard, a Texas redbud. I'd wanted to plant one since I first moved in, but something had always stopped me. HOA guidelines, Karen Myers' glare, my own exhaustion. Now nothing stood in the way. The sapling took root easily. I named it Shelter. Not for me, for what we'd built, for what would remain. Sometimes I still wake up early, old Army habits, and walk the neighborhood before the sun crests the rooftops. The silence now feels different. Not heavy, not foreboding, just quiet, peaceful. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of a child riding their bike past the old Sinkhole site, laughing, shouting to a friend. The earth doesn't answer. It doesn't need to. It's at peace now, too. And so am I.